Some games manage to define a genre. Some even achieve the hallmark of defining a platform. And a tiny elite club managed to define a generation.
To the right!
When I hold you, baby.
My next title under the Time Machine microscope managed all three when it launched on the then new boy on the scene in Sony with its PSX. Bursting onto the scene with more pizzazz than a circus high top, more than just a game. This was a movement, an uprising, an anthem, a title that made gaming cool. In short, it was a total wipeout.
Set you free.
Before we kick off this story, we need to remember the time this was set. Partying was big, raves were cool, and everyone was taking things that they probably shouldn't have done to help them through the night. Now, journeying back to 1994, I was still at school, games at home still predominantly ran with very impressive but 2D visuals, and the good 3D attempts looked and played largely like this. They also carried a stigma of sad, lonely teenagers, no friends, unsociable, a plain bad influence. Hated by teachers, parents and MPs alike. Nothing was going to change that overnight though. The Mega Drive and SNES were still battling it out for high street dominance and mainstream relevance, but behind closed doors a new pretender was emerging. One driven by hunger, a cool, calm and calculated chill glass of revenge on Nintendo after its failed partnership and humiliating public U-turn on the CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, entitled The PlayStation. Yeah, it sounds familiar, right?
Talking about this.
With laser focus, Ken Kutaragi, Big Ken to his friends, assembled a crack team around him to mould not only a trailblazing machine with focused hardware, efficient design, but even more integral, a software suite, community and marketing juggernaut that crushed all underfoot. Fixated on the 20-somethings just starting work with disposable income, it offered something that felt as natural as buying your first car or hitting a nightclub. Delivered through edgy marketing that flipped the finger to conformity and played into the prolonged adolescent dream. Us younger teenagers still wanted in, as it was cool for our older siblings or peers. It must have been 3 times cooler for us mere plebs, right? Now, it was such a well-targeted hype and hardware combo that it could never have failed in hindsight, but on the battleground at the time, it was never so sure. Even if Sony did come into E3 1995 like the lone gunman with no name, not quite dropping the mic as the bomb, its rivals did not as much blink as close their eyes and pray.
$2.99.
Prayers which fell on deaf ears, and the rest is history now. But it took slightly more than just a cheaper price and marketing slogan to die for. Do not underestimate the power of PlayStation became the words for some to do just that.
Sega! Fight! 1. Ready, go!
Rewind a little again to 1994 when the marketing machine kicked into life. Sega had just been basking in its arcade release of Virtua Fighter that did for Fist what racing did for Fuel the year prior. Now, resting on their laurels, they released the next evolution of that board in Model 2 that added full texture mapping and more predominantly filtering at double the frame rate of before. It left all in its wake and theme tune. Although the hopes of having this bespoke power in our bedrooms was never on the menu, Sony had other plans to dominate the console space. Shocking as it may seem, this blindsided Sega, who were clearly far too busy in the woods, admiring its own massive trees. With Sony on the road and wowing developers with its internal graphics demos, eventual vast library of code examples compiled into a streamlined, documented and welcoming development environment, in large part thanks to UK talent they partnered with and or bought. Well-known Saturn Systems, who created easy development kits, tools and code for various machines at the time, Saturn and Sony alike benefited from the small company's skills, becoming a big player in the PlayStation's long-term future, and most certainly in laying the track for the PSX. It was the machine for games designed for developers. This was no half measure. Part of this locust-like consumption involved forming a brand new division in Sony Computer Entertainment, in addition to building a team of internal software groups to really drive home the PSX advantage. Exclusives, something that has been a core pillar of the brand ever since. Now, many companies in those early days were bought up, like many acquisitions, for the portfolio or intellectual property they had within, and some just for the talent they contain. The first of these, UK-based hero Psygnosis Limited in Liverpool, was both, and this company focused their aim to break into all markets as hard as possible.
And a new name was born to the computer games industry. A company that would go on to produce over one.
With its history back to the mid-80s from its first release in Deep Space, Bratakas doesn't count, setting them on the trend of distinct style, amazing graphics and the Amiga maestros they would become. Rising less like a phoenix from the ashes of Imagine and more like an owl, a symbol that would go on to be confirmed as audio and visual nirvana relevant to the time. Gameplay was never as assured, mind. Big hits followed and heads would roll in Barbarian. No, not that Barbarian. This Barbarian. Menace, Blood Money, Xenon II, Shadow of the Beast, Microcosm, The Killing Game Show, aka Fatal Rewind on the Mega Drive or Genesis, the list goes on and on. That particular title is probably the hardest game you'll ever play, if not one of the most frustrating. They improved the gameplay along with the graphics, and Lemming sent them into the stratosphere and was one of the many reasons Sony wanted the brand and catalogue of titles. In addition to its forward-thinking visual CGI work and style, primarily they knew how to create, craft and ship games, something Sony still had little to no experience in. It was another game that would go on to define the team throughout its history though, and vindicate the Sony interest, which was one of a handful of new IPs that hit the PlayStation at launch. Destruction Derby from Martin Edmondson of The Beast fame and crew I have already covered in detail in a previous retrospective, and just like that title, the other was a multi-platform release. Sony are a business after all, and hedging your bets to allow dual releases demonstrated they had the eye on the prize, but the other on the till. Now, as fun and groundbreaking as DD was, it did not have the sheer impact, velocity and pill-popping ecstasy-driven tempo that fitted the machine era and style of the time.
Formats. From Wipeout 2097.
They had found a mammoth in Psygnosis and in turn struck gold with Wipeout that sold more PlayStations than any other single title at launch. It was an absolute monster hit here in the UK of September 95, demonstrated by the UK release having more tracks from such big hitters at the time as the Chemical Brothers, Orbital and Left Field, along with its Wipeout the Music CD that released the following year alongside the Sega Saturn release. It was a cultural movement. The US lapped up the game in November of the same year, with good sales and attach rates, proving this was a surefire acid-raving system seller and brand ambassador. Appearing in clubs at the time to play, mixed with a big beat techno music and underground drug scene that was prevalent at the time in the UK. It latched into and onto the culture and mindset of the time, and it felt perfectly suited to play in public, thanks to its edgy, futuristic vibe, stylish Japanese-influenced design and raw, controversial marketing. It was universally praised by critics and customers alike. With great sales, film appearances, style mags, it managed to make games, and more so PlayStation, instantly cool overnight. Quite the achievement for the lads and lasses from the time. The girl may not only want to watch you play the game, she may even actually join in.
That's a nice score for a girl.
It took a little under 12 months to craft and create this futuristic racer, as it started development in late 1994, well after the PSX dev units had been shipped out to companies, with Psygnosis being among the first to clap hands and eyes on these rare units. Using parts from an earlier Amiga release, the big influences on the title came from Nintendo, and not from the most obvious of locations. Although F-Zero was a game that impressed and clearly had an impact on the team's direction, with it, a certain Red Plumber and his cart-wheeling friends played a bigger role with the game's inception. Closed-loop tracks, a variety of classes, multiple vehicles to choose from, and randomised boosts and weapon pickups all came from the SNES karting classic, dropping the cute style and mushrooms for more adolescent anger and, well, different mushrooms. It was a trip that no one wanted to miss. It was a very, very different to any previous futuristic racer. Bright colours, fast action, undulating tracks, heavy art direction and a thumping soundtrack. The only thing they did carry over from the others was the difficulty in the ship's handling and digital controls. Analog sticks officially never came in until the third game in the series on Sony's machine, but sooner on other machines that adopted this technology first, or the Negcon from Namco. In a sign of how much simpler game engines and content were back in these early 3D days are no clearer than this game. As beautiful, fast and technically strong it was at launch, around 9 months before release it really only existed as a pre-rendered CGI demo that masqueraded as a playable game in the film Hackers. Being the new and UK based in-house team, 13 strong, hardly enough to cover modern AA testing teams now, it demonstrated their prowess in utilising new hardware as well, something they would go on to achieve many times for Sony. Lead artistic development and ideas came from Jim Bowers, who had been instrumental in the rendering path in Microcosm, something that attracted Sony's interest at first. The skills and tools proving advantageous in this 3D shift for them, being used to working within the Microsoft's own soft image that later became Autodesk Maya. Psygnosis built a toolset and pipeline around artist-driven asset creation, tracks and modelling in the application, then porting into the game engine quickly. This is the precursor to modern methods that all of the big studios use for asset creation in games. It kept programming centered on the game engine and away from the artistic direction. They could create a complete set of tracks, textures, bake the lighting and even fly through them within soft image. Once ready, they would be packed up and ported over to the PlayStation to run as the full game, a key ingredient to hitting the tight development window, all stemming from their experience and use of Silicon Graphics workstations already. With the PS1 they had access to a dedicated 3D accelerator in the GTE, Geometry Transformation Engine, that was something very new indeed. The PC was still largely languishing in software renderers, with big push of dedicated 3D hardware yet to land around 1995 and onwards from the likes of ATI's Rage cards or the hallowed Voodoo. But even in this birth of triangle-centric rendering, it still had 2D rasterization, meaning depth, scale or even perspective was ignored once the final buffer was created and passed to screen for raster each frame, something that plagued the life of the console and its sister Sega machine to a lesser degree. Now this caused, among other reasons, the texture warping, edge clipping that occurred in the vast majority of titles on the machine. And as impressive as Wipeout was, it still suffered from this, even though to a lesser degree. But it more than made up for that slight with the bright textured scenery, winding tracks and blistering speed that was a revolution, or a revelation, to what we had seen before. Running in the standard 320x256 non-interlaced image, it zipped across the same 25 FPS rate that all PAL titles did at the time, 30 FPS for the Japanese and US markets, with the reduction of the vertical pixel count to 240 height on the NTSC display to accommodate the increased output speed. With one caveat: these versions did not have their timing poles corrected from the baseline UK version, and as such, PAL players get a 20% faster lap time as a reward for the 20% slower frame rates. Yeah, not really a fair trade-off at all, really. Now, 2 race classes could be chosen with 4 teams and 2 ships each. They could then be thrashed across 6 basic tracks and the not-so-secret 7th Mars track, which would most likely be DLC nowadays. But the combination of incredibly vibrant and futuristic art, physics-based magnetic controls, random pickups, and a thumping soundtrack that fitted the action on screen, it was almost perfect. Almost. The vertical difficulty curve combined with twitchy digital controls and handling made it a tough game to master, and this was even for us more experienced gamers. It goes a long way to demonstrate that a game's mainstream and commercial success hands on much more than gameplay alone. This game's huge impact is a testament to just that. Now, performance was never an issue at all here, rock solid and locked at its 25/30 target with no issues across leaps, rockets or sprawling views. It not only looked the business, sounded the bomb, but it ran like a dream. If it was a car, it would have been a done deal. Now, the small team had an equally steep learning curve to move into this new vertex calculated world. A very competent maths background was needed, and they had taken on some graduates who excelled at just that. With the help of reverse engineering Japan's code examples, they got their heads around the GTE coprocessor quickly, helped in no small part with its pipeline and tools from aforementioned SN Systems involvement, and later purchased by Sony, as they, like Psygnosis, were instrumental in the console's success and adoption within the wider game development community, creating a simple and cheaper PC plug-in option rather than an expensive dev machine from Japan. All helped shape the friendlier, ergonomic environment that allowed such talent to shine on the machine in both small and big teams. Ridge Racer was still the mouth-watering jewel in the PSX crown from launch, but it was pipped by the Western launch here as Wipeout became the new demo piece to show off the machine's potential, something the team were persistent with throughout their existence on each new hardware launch. That I will cover more in my second two-part Wipeout coverage. It was under pressure, non-ideal conditions on hardware that was brand new, with a rebirth of the game making and rendering as a whole, but sometimes you perform better under pressure, and Psygnosis must have been stuck in a vice with the results like this. Sega was still a big competition for Sony in the UK and the US. In the 16-bit 4th gen era, it actually had the biggest market share at one point in North America, and Europe had long become Sonic Land. Nintendo was still fumbling around behind the scenes with its Ultra 64, late to the next gen party, something they make a habit of. Now, as focused as Sony were to become Kingpin, they were still a business, then as now, which allowed the game to appear on quite a few other machines. With the internal friendly rivalry between the Reflections team on Destruction Derby and the Wipeout team, the outsourced Perfect Entertainment team that had a deal with them to handle the Destruction Derby port also took the two Saturn releases of Wipeout. The first just under a year later and outsourced to the Australian Tantalus team, who they owned at the time. They built themselves quite a reputation of being Saturn maestros themselves, with many other in-house Sega ports like Manx TT and House of the Dead also being converted from the arcades into the 32-bit Sega Beast. But in the first attempt on Wipeout, it was a very, very competent port in all areas, except, you guessed it, performance. Now, aside the loss of the licensed tracks, something the US release of the PSX version also suffered, this is the only fly in the ointment in what was or is at times more than a match for its Sony sibling. The locked 25 FPS is instead replaced with a locked 17 or 18, which is far from ideal and as smooth as its rivals, but still much more consistent than the Destruction Derby port. An equal frame rate may not have been achieved here, but the consistency certainly is much closer. Once the initial acclimatization moving from PS1 to Saturn is weathered, then the reward is a slightly better handling game due to the controller and slower pace, a symptom of the game being physically faster than the higher the frame rate goes. You'll see this to the extreme later in 2097. But the Saturn had one advantage that played into the engine's design that is not widely known. The game rendered its polygons with both triangles and quadrilaterals, the latter being exactly what the Saturn did on every 3D object. The PS1 had to create these from 2 tries, and this benefited the Saturn version in addition to its handling of texture mapping slightly differently to the PS1, which reduced texture warping in the game, although not always as they draw closer to the camera. With on-screen examples, you can see the texture stretches and jumps or twists on the PS1. This is not as evident on the Sega machine. It did not use quads on all polygons, mind, only dividing them up within a short range of the frustum, coinciding with the highest quality map being applied on these UV coordinates. This gave the PS1 that unstable jump of model surfaces and textures as they drew into the camera view, as did the Saturn. Now, this is largely due to the fixed point integer mathematics in use for vertices and the final scanline rasterization process, but I have I've covered this before in my 16-bit PS4 Pro video. This is why objects pop in and out of place or snap due to the low resolution and lack of any subpixel calculation. Imagine a grid to represent the pixels as shown on screen. When a vertex moves in 3D space or vectors, it has to be truncated when transformed into the 2D display. Thus, they only move or jump into the next position at a certain point, and this will be per vertices and not per object. This results in the wobbly objects you see in many 3D games in this generation on these two machines. The higher the resolution, the less this will be noticed, and is why PC emulators help reduce this effect. Another issue has also come from the affine texture format of the machine, often referred to as the reason, and then leave it to that without any explanation. But they are, in fact, two separate issues. Here I will try to explain it as best I can, and what this all means, why it happens, and how come the Saturn was less affected by this, but not the aforementioned watery objects issue. You see, the PS1 was a 2D wolf in 3D clothing, as was the Saturn, and this is a general misconception by many of the machines that really kicked off the 32-bit era. Although the PS1 supported a GPU accelerator for rendering polygons and vertices within the 3D space, when it came to rasterizing them, it was all ignored, largely due to the lack of a Z buffer or depth buffer to inform the location of the object being rasterized within the 2D plane. Now, with no Z info to hand, it discarded all that information and had to raster, i.e. draw the object on screen with no concept of depth or perspective. This means that when an object is texture mapped within its surface details, the PS1 used affine texture mapping, meaning parallel relationship. So the textures are not linear mapped from the flat 3D points of the triangle and the flat camera view on screen. This takes the vertices that are within the triangles or quads and then aligns them to the object on screen within screen space only, using inverse texture mapping. Now, the larger size relatively of the triangles and the fact that they were mapped to the triangles, they all fall within the screen space view, meant the connection to the triangles was all relative to the way they were drawn to fill the space. For example, if we take a flat rectangle on the floor or wall here that was built up with two triangle edges to make the shape, just spoke about the quads earlier, with the depth alignment drawing the left and right edge parallel to each other as they go into the screen away from the view, and they get closer as they go back. To achieve this effect, the rectangle is drawn with two tries of unequal size, one smaller and shorter than the other. Now, this creates a perfect vector silhouette with depth. But once the machine comes to apply the texture to each triangle via the flat UV points, all it sees are two flat triangles of different sizes connected. Now, this is done via fixed point interpolation along a horizontal line, and as such, it applies the same flat bitmap texture to these two triangles according to the vertex points on the flat screen, and ignores any perception of viewing angle or depth, as it has no idea. Due to the non-linear transformation, the distance or space between these points may not be maintained, and as such, this causes the distortion that the machine was infamous for. The Saturn suffered from similar 2D goggles, except it did not use affine texture mapping, with its 2D base being rooted around scaling and rotation and translation. It all perfect for the pseudo 3D games that the machine was born from. This was an obvious continuation of that, with quads being a natural progression of the base rectangle used for these common 2D effects. This is why you hear a lot of people say that it doesn't really use polygons, more warped sprites. That is effectively what they mean. It uses forward texture mapping instead of affine, which allowed a form of perspective correction if the quads were aligned with the texture direction or the quads themselves were mapped or baked onto the objects directly. The fact it used quads meant that the same rectangle was drawn as a single object using 4 vertices, whereby the same object on the PlayStation was created from 2 triangles, 6 vertices, that shared verts across one axis. This meant that to achieve the same shape required, it had to do it using 2 triangles and 6 verts rather than 4. This meant you're doubling your amount of primitives of polygons here than you were on the Saturn in these instances. It also explains why you saw more split seams and gaps from the fixed point mathematics here, which was less affected on the Saturn due to this form of quads being drawn rather than triangles, but suffered other issues all of its own. Texture warping still occurred as they drew close to the camera, but they fell within the quad and stretched in one direction rather than spinning and panning around. You get a stretched and then squashed texture instead. Another way to resolve this was to subdivide or tessellate the polygon further, which is the trick many games used, and as the PS1 could draw more on screen than the Saturn, it helped it follow the same subdivide LOD routine that you can see here from the wireframe Saturn version of Wipeout 2097. As it gives you a good example of the amount being thrown around here. The world was created with quite a large portion, with even the birds being created by the VDP1 line drawing mode. You can also see that the objects on screen are almost entirely constructed of quads so as to achieve the same poly count, and the PS1 had to draw effectively twice the number of triangles, which, as we know, it did with ease. Now, this doesn't mean that the Saturn can't draw triangles. The way they used to do this was actually, as I've just mentioned about the vertices, by sharing the same verts across one single item, i.e. your vert 1 and vert 2. You pinch them together and thus make a triangle, which you can see again in the wireframe mode here on the Saturn, that it did use triangles. Now, due to this subdivide routine used by Psygnosis and Tantalus, Wipeout is not as badly affected by this on the close view near clipping issues, which still plague many PS1 and Saturn titles due to the tries being clipped rather than the quad, which causes to see through objects on both, but more so on the Sony machine in the near area. And again, like I say, the seam issue. You can see an example in the tunnel as the roof breaks apart on the PS1 and doesn't do that at all on the Saturn, and you don't get the near clipping objects quite as often and disappearing as you do on the Sega machine. Now, another change between them is the Saturn uses lower resolution bitmaps for the texels across all screen objects, partially due to the fact that it had to share its 2512 screen buffers between VDP1 and VDP2. The PS1 had a whole 1 meg all to itself, which meant it had to have slightly lower quality texels. Now, this is the reason they look slightly blockier on the Sega machine, due to the same sample point on the texture having to cover a wider area on the polygon, meaning the same point is sampled more often, and the result is bandier and blockier textures at times. Not all though, as the PlayStation did not have a dedicated 2D GPU like the Saturn, and this meant that the backdrop, which would be your standard skybox now, is actually still drawn with polygons and then texture mapped onto these, making it a 3D object. It didn't have the 2D options the Saturn has. You can see the same sub-pixel movement on the verts causing the watery image, but this did allow the sky to move across the Y and X axis as you went up or down the track. The Saturn did not, and instead, like the trees and trackside objects, it draws all these within its VDP2 as a 2D object within the planes that it has available to it. This results in near identical sprite objects in the distance and a higher resolution for the backdrops, as the console could have split resolutions between the two display processors, and the fact that it was using most of its RAM just to render this alone, resulting in a better quality skybox than the PS1 at a higher texture level with no sub-pixel shimmer present at all. A welcome boost, as the PlayStation's dithering is also lost, giving a richer true colour bit depth. The roadside colours and textures are also brighter on the Saturn and go some way to hide the lower resolution and bit depth of them compared to the PS1. It also has a slightly longer draw distance on the Saturn within the frustum, clipping objects a few feet further into the distance. It did still have the standard dithered effect on shields and shadow effects from the VDP1 limitations, which were fully transparent on the PS1, along with the smoke and particle effects, but they look much better here and work consistently, and unless you use a VDP2, this is an understandable sacrifice. This makes the two versions very close indeed, and much closer than the last Destruction Derby release, with more time on the engine and a different team that amended the game's engine to work better within the hardware it was intended for. The PS1 is still the best due to the faster and smoother gameplay, but the battle is close, with wins and losses on both sides. If you had a Saturn like me at the time with my PS1, it was not as clear cut as to which machine was winning the war. Something not so true of the MS-DOS version that shipped in the same year, with 3D accelerators still not really landed yet. This was a complete software-driven renderer, and as such you can see the results on screen. Much lower resolution than both consoles, lower bit depth, lower texture quality, and basically lower effects. It ran at a pretty fast 30 FPS, but again the VSync is off, therefore it tears all over the screen as you play and race. The game is smooth and responsive, but it looks terrible next to its console cousins and cries out for some hardware 3D acceleration. something it got in the second release a couple of years later in Wipeout 2097. This game released on the Saturn and the PS1 and the Amiga, but this was very close to the PC release we see here, but this was at the time when Amigas were all being completely upgraded using separate hardware and accelerators that you just took in and out of the machine itself. The PC version is something very different indeed. It was nowhere near running in the level you can see here on screen, but it did have a 640x480 resolution mode, and potentially you could run it at 60 frames per second, but it was doubtful you had a machine and GPU fast enough to do just that. It was most likely running worse than what you see on the consoles, but here on modern hardware you can see that the engine has this problem with its frame rate, which we've mentioned already on the split between the two. The slower the game, the slower the lap times. The faster the game, therefore, the faster the lap times, because the game just runs in a speeded up mode, making it almost impossible to play if you want to run it at an unlocked 60Hz frame rate. But if you cap it to 25 on modern hardware or 30, then you do get a much more consistent game, and the clarity is certainly there over what was available on the consoles. Moving between the Saturn and the PlayStation 1, you can see that the frame rate gap is exactly the same. But this time, the Sony machine struggles to keep hold of that 25 FPS gap, and at times on certain tracks drops down to exactly the same 17 or most likely 20 compared to the American versions that you see here on screen. This is because the game is drawing far more polygons and textures and effects, along with better lighting, using light shades now on the textures themselves as you pass over power-ups in certain parts of the map. This was also carried over into the Saturn release, swapping out the texture on the ship itself to emulate a light source on both versions, and it works effectively. The visual quality, again the same transparency issues appear. You can see the smoke in the background, and the fog effect has that dithered effect because it's drawn using the VDP-1 on the Saturn, which would make much more sense to draw it using the VDP-2. But again, these are the options and techniques that teams had to get used to and their head around to make it work within the game. The visual quality here is very close indeed. They made the Saturn version actually have almost identical quality texture maps here than the Sony PlayStation 1. Therefore, you see a much better quality on the visuals and the textures, even though the dithering is again present on the Sony PlayStation. They visually look very close indeed, but the Saturn takes the edge on slightly better texture quality and color depth, due to the fact that it doesn't use this full screen dithering that PlayStation was rife with. Again, the Saturn loses out on a visual effect, with the light trail on the PS1 missing the transparency effect and the same dithered effect on the VDP-1 draw at the back. But these are minor omissions, and the performance is slightly better on the PS1 than the Saturn, but it does dip right down to the same levels, so this can affect you as you play the game more often. But the Saturn did have one big advantage, and that was this: the controller. They now had the 3D options on the Saturn to play this game with a full analog controller, which again wasn't available at the time for the PlayStation, wasn't supported officially unless you used the Negic G-Com, which the game did support from Namco. So the game actually had better controls on the Saturn than it did on the PlayStation due to this controller, and it's how I prefer to play the game now. I actually really enjoy both these versions, and I think it's nearly the highlight of the Wipeout franchise. But I think the Saturn for me just takes the edge due to the fact that once you get used to the frame rate, it's more solid across play, and I enjoy the improved quality of the textures and colour slightly more on a CRT display here than what you're seeing on screen at the moment. So it wins, in my opinion, of the slightly better version between the PlayStation and the Saturn, and I think Tantalus deserve a great round of applause for using the hardware very effectively to deliver a very impressive and substantially closer and sadly final port to the Sega machine. But it was not the end for the Wipeout series, as Nintendo had finally released their Ultra 64, bringing full Z depth and floating point calculations, giving sub-pixel images and much better 3D, and both these 32-bit machines could muster, and Wipeout benefited greatly from this. But it's all a tale for my second part in the Wipeout series, which will continue this and on and beyond, bringing us right up to launch of the brand new remaster due out next month. So join me next week for part 2. If you enjoyed this or anything else that I've put together, then please support the channel and the website by liking and subscribing below. Please share it if possible and where appropriate. Leave all your thoughts and feedback below. And I'll see you next time in the Gravity League.
Welcome to the world of anti-gravity racing. The next stage in motorsports. It's about winning at any cost. It's real. It's dangerous.
And you're gonna love it.
Wipeout Fusion.
It's called Mental Wealth.